So I am pretty much in the camp of failure is not an option. I think that's actually a phrase that my family used a lot, and so it's very much ingrained within me. And it's been very difficult to think about failure as something that can be empowering and move you forward in a way that maybe succeeding wouldn't necessarily. But I do think I appreciate people who say things like you should fail once every day, right? I think that's one of my areas of growth is that I should be more embracing of those failures. I think my perfectionism and my drive to succeed and my fear of appearing vulnerable has often been clouded by living in the world as a queer woman of color, right? As somebody who isn't supposed to succeed, that there are so many things stacked against me that I shouldn't be here. I think there are, if you look at the demographics of professors in the United States, for instance, Chicanas and Latinas make up less than 1% of the total faculty that are employed across the nation. And so thinking about my space in the academy then becomes this very big responsibility. And for me, failure is really clouded within those systems of racism and sexism that are not quite afforded to me in the same ways as people with privilege might be. And so I absolutely think that there is value in failure, but the fear becomes what happens when you fail and what are the consequences for that if you are somebody who is in a marginalized position in our society. That failure is judged much more harshly for someone like me than it is for instance, one of my white male colleagues. So I do struggle with that a lot. I think failure is really important and valuable. But until we get to a point in which everyone can fail equally, I think that I will probably still work very hard to not fail in spaces where I'm not afforded that luxury. But in spaces where I might be afforded that luxury, I think failure is really important to build up your sense of continuing to learn, right? So I think oftentimes, again, working in anti-racist spaces, a lot of times in my observations, white folks who are consider themselves allies, who see themselves as wanting to engage in these practices of building a more just and equitable world, often are afraid to fail. They're afraid to say the wrong thing. They're afraid to be in an intentional conversation about race with a person of color because they might say something wrong, they might do something wrong. And I think that that can be very dangerous in moving forward. And again, creates this cycle of blame on people of color themselves, actually, right? And I've had a lot of experiences like that where I feel like I have to apologize to people who have done something racist towards me just so we can move on and have a dialogue or continue to do our work alongside one another. And I think that that is a really bad precedent to set. And so failure in that case should be something that we just accept is going to happen, right? We are not perfect. I'm not perfect. I tell my students this all the time. I am in a system in which racism is operating at all times, right? We see images of people who are different from ourselves and have stereotypes or prejudices against them that are ingrained in our society. And so to think that we've addressed this issue, that we've learned about it, that we went to one training on diversity and so we know everything and so we don't need to learn anything more is really dangerous. And I think that that's connected to failure somehow, that we're afraid to go into these spaces and fail in intentional dialogues when we're trying to create those anti-racist spaces or spaces that aren't necessarily, heteronormative or always about the status quo of heterosexual relationships or families being lauded as the best. And so for me, I would encourage people to fail more in those ways. And I think that failure is important. for people who are trying to make change. And what becomes more important then on the other side of that would be the ability to forgive yourself for making those mistakes. I think often that's where we stop, right? We get too afraid that we're going to do it again, and so we don't own up to what went wrong in that moment. And I think that we should find more ways to hold ourselves accountable, to forgive ourselves, to know that we were doing the best that we could, and to be as honest and genuine with people about when we make mistakes, and hope that we can learn and move on from them.
Great, thank you. It occurred to me when you were talking about the failure is not an option being a message in your family. Are there other sort of messages from your families or like cultural traditions or anything that any of those other things that you would say have shaped how you
have shaped my life, my worldview? Oh dear.
Only the ones you want to share.
Yes. Well, I am just thinking about another one. So it also has to do with failure. My dad would often say, fail to plan, plan to fail. And so this was a message. So again, about failure. Failure is not an option is what my mom would say. My dad would say, plan to fail, or fail to plan, plan to fail. And so clearly this is stacked up against me in terms of my ability to fail. But I think that there is something to say about that saying, right? That if you, and that I think I would be a little bit more radical in thinking about it both ways. So my dad and I don't always see eye to eye on a lot of things, and this might be one of them. But I am a planner. I do like to plan things. I like to be prepared. I like to imagine all possible outcomes and consequences from what I might say or, what I might be participating in. And so I do think planning can be great. Again, if we go around this notion of planning as intentionally including people, building an inclusive space, etc. But this idea of failing to plan means that you may as well plan to fail yourself, I think can be kind of problematic. So I think there should be spaces where we're allowed to fail, and to embrace that. Let me think about other things. Those are like the ones that are coming to my mind right now. It's really interesting. I feel like this is a therapy session. Like, oh wow, I'm going to have to engage in that a little bit more. I think I don't have a great statement about it, but I think my parents both taught me to be authentic and genuine, and that being authentic and genuine would lead to good things. So they might have shaped that in terms of, loyalty or being trustworthy or being respectful. And I think those are all qualities that many communities hold in common, right? I don't think you could look at any community and say like, oh yeah, they teach people to be disrespectful or not. They don't care about trustworthiness. And so again, that might become a common site where we might be able to have some shared values with one another when we might see things differently. But also, to be ourselves and to be authentically ourselves in any space that we're in, which can be very vulnerable and also frightening for people. But I think, again, this really relates to my multiple identities, my intersecting identities, is that I don't really have the luxury of not being my authentic self wherever I go, because I've found as I've grown up that when I don't address things that I see as wrong or that personally harm me, or even others that might not be directly related to me, I feel like I have let myself and my community down. And I wish that more people lived in a context like that, right? I think my identity has made that at the forefront of my existence in my communities. But I wish that it wasn't just my responsibility. That really should be everyone's responsibility, right? To stand up, no matter how hard it might be, to challenge the status quo, to speak back against something that you feel could be hurtful to someone, even if they're not saying it is hurtful to them in that moment, or even if that person who might be hurt isn't in the room. And I think so often we find ourselves in spaces with people who look like us, who act like us, who have the same values as us, and we don't have to do that kind of hard work. But again, my life as somebody who is involved in these multiple communities has meant that I'm often in places where I'm the only person who looks like me. Might be the only person of color in the room. I might be the only queer person in the room. Sometimes I'm the only woman in the room, right? And I'm always the only queer woman of color in the room. I can almost for sure say that. And so it becomes this very hard responsibility to bear, but it becomes easier when I know that that's shared across other people who are also valuing that it's not just my job to bring attention to that, right? That it's all of our jobs.